Welcome to the Global War Watch Network. So the big news we're looking at today, the USS Gerald R. Ford, arguably the world's most powerful warship, is currently leading NATO drills up in the North Sea. It's a pretty clear signal being sent towards Moscow. This deployment, part of Exercise Neptune Strike, really puts the Ford carrier strike group right there in the high North waters. It's a significant move.
It absolutely is. And that massive signal, that really frames our central question for today's debate, doesn't it? Is deploying the Ford the effective way to execute NATO's deterrent strategy against Russia's, growing maritime ambitions in the Arctic? Or is this deployment, frankly, a very, very expensive political statement that might actually risk escalation? And does it even properly address Russia's main asymmetric military advantages in that specific region?
Right. And my position is that the Ford's presence there is, essential. It brings that necessary high-end deterrence capability that NATO absolutely needs to field if it wants to credibly counter Russia, especially given their explicit focus on the high north in their own military planning.
And I'm going to argue, from a slightly different angle, I think this deployment is probably suboptimal, maybe even a high risk. It leans heavily on conventional tonnage, on that sheer size and power, in a threat environment that isn't really about carrier versus carrier anymore. It's defined by advanced submarines, long-range anti-ship missiles, and very specific Arctic logistics areas where, let's be honest, Russia holds some significant regional advantages.
Okay, let's start with the basics. The strategic need here. Russia's 2022 maritime doctrine, it's pretty blunt. It explicitly names NATO and the U.S. as the primary security threats, and it puts a heavy emphasis on the Arctic zone. Now, if Moscow is framing this competition in clear military terms, NATO has to respond credibly. And that means bringing its most capable, its highest-end asset to bear, which right now is the Ford-class carrier. This isn't just symbolism. It's a necessary demonstration of capability designed specifically for a peer-level fight. You've got this generational leap in power generation, the new A1B reactors pushing out 600 megawatts. Now, people talk about future-directed energy weapons, sure, but right now, that huge power margin is absolutely critical for running the advanced sensors, things like the ANSPY-3 radar, and just as importantly, the cooling systems needed for sustained high-tempo flight operation, especially in the cold, contested environment of the high north. And strategically, this deployment is vital because it's operating farther north than U.S. carriers typically have. It enhances our awareness in really critical maritime choke points. We're talking the Barents Gap, that access point between the Barents Sea, where Russia's northern fleet is based, and the Norwegian Sea.
That's certainly a point about the intended capability. But I'd frame that assessment, quite differently. The deployment is a clear signal, yes, I grant you that. But it's an incredibly costly one. And I think it potentially distracts from the actual nature, the reality of Russia's regional military strengths. We're talking about a lead ship that costs $13 billion. And it's faced, let's be frank, well-documented technical challenges, particularly with the reliability of the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, EMALS, and the advanced weapons elevators. Now, the theory is that EMALS allows for, 30% more sorties. That sounds impressive. But the public data we have so far suggests the Ford's actual operational sortie rate hasn't consistently hit that theoretical high bar yet. But the bigger strategic issue for me is that Russia's 2022 doctrine, it heavily prioritizes asymmetric threats. We're talking highly sophisticated, very quiet submarines, the Yasenem class, the Beret class SSBNs, and increasingly long-range anti-ship missiles, including hypersonics now. And against those kinds of advanced precision systems, a 100,000-ton carrier just presents this, exquisite high-value target. And on top of that, the U.S. and NATO collectively, they just don't have the necessary Arctic-specific support assets, particularly icebreakers. Russia has, by far, the world's largest fleet, including the nuclear-powered Arctica class. So NATO's logistical and operational disadvantage is, I think, undeniable in a region where Russia controls more than half the coastline and has spent years modernizing its military bases there.
Okay, I see why you're emphasizing the technical, let's call them teething issues, and the asymmetric threat. It's a valid concern, but let me offer a different perspective on that vulnerability point. The purpose of a carrier strike group,
The whole concept isn't for it to operate as one single ship. It's designed to project power as an integrated, multi-layered system. The GRF-CSG is built to function like a layered porcupine, specifically for operating in these high-threat environments. The carrier itself doesn't sail alone. It relies on integrated defenses, the Aegis combat system, the ANSBY-3 radar I mentioned, which is crucial for the evolved Sea Sparrow missile defense system, giving it strong localized defense, and the air wing is constantly working to extend its reach.
You've got the MQ-25 Stingray tanker coming online, long-range standoff weapons. This allows the carrier itself to operate outside the densest missile threat rings while still projecting significant power. And this ability, the ability to project air power without needing a fixed political base on land, is absolutely crucial for protecting vital sea lines of communication, especially that traditional choke point, the GI-UK gap, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, which is the path Russian forces would need to take to break out into the wider Atlantic. And, importantly, the joint exercise structure itself, Neptune Strike, involving 13 allied nations, that enhances coalition cohesion, interoperability. That is the foundational strength of NATO deterrence.
The problem, though, is that layered defense doesn't automatically equal invulnerability, especially when you're facing Russia's top-tier quiet submarines. They are the main power projection tool for their northern fleet. So even with advanced systems, a single very large carrier remains a major liability. You say the carrier sits outside the dense threat rings. Okay, but that raises a critical operational question, doesn't it? If the Ford is operating defensively way back in a safer zone, is it truly projecting meaningful air power into the critical high-value areas near Russian territory? Or is it just sort of occupying the periphery? Does the MQ-25 Stingray tanker really give strike aircraft enough range to genuinely threaten key Russian targets like the Severomorsk naval base? And look, we already have concrete evidence that the Ford's presence immediately triggered a significant and I'd say high-stakes Russian counterresponse. There were confirmed reports widely covered of a 48-hour NATO aerial operation just tracking 3 Yasin-class submarines operating nearby the strike group. This, to me, highlights the strategic drain. The mere presence of a super high-value target like the Ford instantly draws Russia's best asymmetric assets, forcing NATO to expend huge amounts of anti-submarine warfare ASW resources just to keep tabs on vessels that are already known to be incredibly stealthy and lethal.
But hold on, that rigorous counter-tracking operation, that shows deterrence is working, not failing. We found them, we tracked them using assets like the P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft. We leaned on them hard. That signals control. That signals domain awareness. It tells them we see them.
I find that reasoning a bit circular, if I'm honest. We're celebrating the success of tracking submarines that our $13 billion asset attracted into the area in the first place. Isn't this just an immensely expensive and resource-intensive way to achieve domain awareness? Couldn't dedicated, persistent ASW platforms and maybe seabed sensor networks provide that more cost-effectively? The high operating costs of the carrier group, combined with its vulnerability, especially to hypersonics, it makes the deterrent effect seem quite fragile. Shouldn't the focus be more on building up the fundamental ASW and domain awareness infrastructure? Because reports suggest NATO still has a relatively low level of sensors and arguably insufficient non-US naval assets to really tackle the submarine threat comprehensively.
Well, you seem to be focusing very much on the tactical cost, the platform level cost-benefit, whereas I'm looking at the strategic impact of its presence, the political and military signal it sends.
And I'm arguing that strategic impact is fundamentally mismatched with the reality of the theater, the operational reality. You champion U.S. tonnage supremacy. What is it, 3.4 million tons for the U.S. Navy versus Russia's maybe 850,000 tons? Okay, that huge quantitative gap, it obscures the fact that Russia fights differently in its near abroad. They focus on an A2AD strategy, anti-access area denial, particularly centered on the Kola Peninsula. That's a stark contrast to the U.S. global power projection model. And the $13 billion Ford, which is designed for global power projection, is simply not the ideal tool for trying to break through dense A2AD defenses that rely on fast, mobile, and relatively cost-effective missile and submarine platforms. Now, yes, Russia's doctrine sets out these huge ambitions to be a great maritime power, establishing 21 objectives specifically for the Arctic, which is more than any other region. But their actual ability to achieve all that, it's realistically limited, especially given the economic strain from the war in Ukraine. You mentioned earlier the Admiral Kuznetsov, their old carrier, is basically being scrapped. That's legacy gear, sure, but it does highlight the financial constraints they are under.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, though. You point to economic strain, fine, but that doesn't mean we should just dismiss Russia's doctrine out of hand. It's a clear statement of intent, and it's backed by consistent, targeted, strategic investment where it matters most to them. Russia is simultaneously launching the new, stealthier Boryay A-class ballistic missile submarines and the Yasin-M guided missile submarines. These are the cutting-edge assets that define their naval strategy. Doesn't that selective investment prove their capacity and their will to prioritize strategic modernization over just raw tonnage? We know they've maintained and modernized over 50 military bases across their Arctic zone. They're heavily investing in the Northern Sea Route infrastructure. This pattern, this militarization of their foreign policy, it demands a robust, clear NATO reaction. The Ford's presence signals unequivocally that NATO will not simply cede the region to this kind of coercive militarism, and this is absolutely essential for reassuring key allies like Norway, who are right there on the front line and have been actively advocating for more alliance involvement precisely because they see this Russian expansion firsthand.
Reassurance is vital, I agree, but just increasing the sheer amount of military hardware in the region risks escalating geostrategic tensions, perhaps unnecessarily, especially given Russia's historical sensitivity and warnings about major NATO exercises near its borders. Deterrence needs to be proportional. It needs to be carefully calibrated to avoid stumbling into some kind of uncontrolled spiral of military buildup, and we need to think about the operational proximity here. Operating the Ford in the North Sea, even if it stays further south than the Barents, potentially puts it within range of regional, high-speed, long-range Russian assets launched from the Kola Peninsula, things like the Kinzhal hypersonic missile or advanced Kalibr cruise missiles. And Russia's nuclear doctrine, well, it maintains a degree of ambiguity, including the potential use of non-strategic nuclear weapons to supposedly de-escalate a conventional conflict if they feel the state is threatened. Placing such a high-value, symbolic asset like the Ford relatively close to this potential theater of engagement, it creates a dangerous vulnerability. It complicates any attempt at escalation management and could force NATO into a higher state of readiness than might otherwise be needed.
But the very fact that Russia employs nuclear signaling as a tool of coercion is precisely why NATO needs to respond with calm determination and decisive conventional strength. Our own U.S. national strategy for the Arctic explicitly states the intent to deter threats and increase military presence. It acknowledges the end of Arctic exceptionalism, as they put it. This deployment is about demonstrating escalation dominance. Integrating the Ford Carrier Strike Group, with its advanced command and control C2 capabilities, ensures that any NATO reaction to Russian recklessness, whether that's air incursions or overly aggressive close proximity maneuvers by their ships or aircraft, is decisive, coordinated, and crucially, non-escalatory unless directly threatened. The goal here is to project a level of conventional power that convinces Moscow that the cost of initiating any conflict would simply be prohibitive.
That assumes, though, absolute faith that those sophisticated command and control systems and all the lead ship technologies on the Ford function flawlessly under extreme pressure. And given the Ford's well-documented development history, relying on that flawless performance and the harsh, demanding conditions of the high north, well, that feels like a substantial assumption to make.
Ultimately, the USS Gerald R. Ford is out there proving its operational readiness. It completed a successful first full deployment, and now it's operating further north than previous carriers. I maintain it's a powerful, flexible, and yes, essential instrument of integrated deterrence. It symbolizes NATO's commitment to forward defense against a clearly revisionist power.
And while its capability isn't in doubt, its sheer power. The deployment, for me, fundamentally underscores the strategic mismatch. It highlights the gap between NATO's preferred conventional power projection model and Russia's focus on asymmetric, arguably more cost-effective regional capabilities, particularly their submarines and their Arctic infrastructure, including icebreakers. The Ford's presence really throws into sharp relief the immediate need for NATO to invest much more heavily in Arctic-specific support systems, in better sensor networks, and crucially, in dedicated anti-submarine warfare platforms and vessels if it truly wants to counter Russia's actual regional strengths up there.
I think we can agree that the future of maritime security in the high north will indeed depend heavily on whether the Ford-class carriers can reliably deliver on their intended performance metrics, particularly generating sorties at scale under pressure. And, just as importantly, whether NATO successfully integrates the necessary long-range strike capabilities and advanced ASW assets to ensure these carriers can operate effectively while staying safely outside those increasingly dense Russian threat rings.
Yes, and considering the pace of technological change on both sides and the shifting strategic landscape, there is certainly a lot more to explore in the material about how the carrier air wing needs to evolve and the significant industrial base challenges involved in truly supporting a sustained forward defense posture in the Arctic.
Well, thank you for joining us today for this very insightful discussion. We really appreciate your time and participation.
Yes, and please remember to like, share, and subscribe to the Global War Watch Network.
And do share your own thoughts on this deployment in the comments section below. You can also join us on social media. All the links you need are provided right there in the description.